Welcome to Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Botcherbeck, and with me today is our senior analyst, Laurence Sanford, via Zoom today. Larry, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Joy, and you?
Good, thank you. Today we're going to discuss his latest paper on China and Central America, part 2, and we are going to focus on Nicaragua. And Larry, in your paper, you state Nicaragua is a communist dictatorship under a Marxist leader, Daniel Ortega. So for our listeners, we'd like to do a little definition of communism. And I'm going to take it from Merriam-Webster. And there are several different points they bring up. One, a system in which goods are owned in common or available to all as needed. That being said, that's kind of the utopia view of communism.
Yes.
Which we really don't see happening in any nation today. There's also that would include the theory of eliminating private property. And they also say a totalitarian system of government in which a single authoritarian party controls state-owned means of production. Now that does seem to be taking place in countries today. And yes. Finally, the final stage of Marxist theory, in which the state has withered away and economic goods are distributed equitably. I'm sorry. Again, I would say that's not happening either. No. Daniel Ortega and his Marxist leadership.
Well, you have to say one thing for Daniel Ortega. He has longevity. I mean, he's been around since the 1970s with the Nicaragua Contra War, where he was in a guerrilla group of far left guerrillas trying to take over the Nicaraguan government, which was basically a military dictatorship. And they eventually succeeded. I'm sure you remember Oliver North and Reagan and the Contra War and all that stuff. But Ortega survived the war, and eventually he was elected president. And in 1990, he lost the election, but he resurrected himself and claimed to become a Catholic and reformed himself and became president in 2007, and has been there ever since, because once they get their claws into the government, and he brought in Cuban and Russian intelligence people to help him. And so he is probably pretty safely ensconced and will be there for the rest of his life as long as he wants to be the president dictator. And one thing that I would add to the definition of communism is they're violently anti-Christian, anti-religion, and particularly Christianity, which values individual right. Everybody's equal in the eyes of God. And you see this in Nicaragua. They just arrested the cardinal. They suppressed the Catholic Church. They suppressed the Protestants who were there. And they do that because there can only be one God. That one God, of course, is the utopian socialism that down the road will have heaven on earth. And it never happens.
Which is very interesting because, like I was saying, this really started with the Christians trying to bring their goods together and share it equitably or distribute it between everyone. So the total opposite is happening here.
Yes, absolutely correct. And being a communist or a Marxist, the difference between a Marxist and a communist is just the word. A communist believes in Marxism, and Marxism is state control as you define it. And being a Marxist communist, he has an ideological affinity towards China, which is ruled by the Communist Party, but again is really a fascist state. And a fascist state is basically a totalitarian state, as is a communist state. But the difference is a fascist state allows private property under strict government control. But They're both very anti-religion. They're both very much against individual freedom. They have total control over the media and personal lives. They allow the capitalism some degree of freedom, but under very strict government control. And that certainly is communism. Right? you have an organization in China that has more than 50 people or 100 people, you have to have a Communist Party political operative in your system. And also China has a law, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, as a national law is that if the government asks you to spy or provide intelligence, you have the legal obligation to do that. And that's, of course, spins off into TikTok and WeChat and all the Chinese organizations that supposedly are to help Americans to develop battery factories and so forth. They're operating under the CCP rules. And the rule is, if the government asks you for information, you have to give it. So that's where we are with Nicaragua. And of course, being a communist state, the prosperity is not all that great. And it just goes on and on.
Yes, unfortunately, what we see with I would say, new definition of communism, the authoritarian rule, you have the elite parties making the money, and there's a big difference between them and the rest of the working class.
I remember many years ago, I read a book called The New Class. It was written by Diaz, a Yugoslav, or I don't know what he would be in today's world, but he was from Yugoslavia when it was a communist state. And he wrote a devastating book, basically saying, it's the top 10% that do very well in communism, and it's the remaining 90% that don't do so well. So when Cuba says they have the fairest medical system in the world, in a way, they're right, because everybody's treated terribly and has no drugs except for the elite. So the United States, we have some inequities, but in Cuba, everybody's the same, so they don't have anything other than the 5 or 6% elite rulers. And China, 10% of their population is in the Communist Party. Russia was pretty much the same percentage, Soviet Union. So it's the elite that do real well. And in the United States, we have the elite leading us from the Ivy League schools and other so-called elite schools that go for 80 or 90,000 bucks a year. They've really not done America great.
Well, we could argue that some of the elite might want to lean more Marxist anyway, because it would benefit them.
Yes, precisely because they know more than you and I. Yeah, they know more than you and I how our lives should be led. Whereas capitalism, and in the United States is very socialistic. It has very many social programs, Social Security, Medicare, blah, blah, blah. There's a million programs. As a matter of fact, I'm concerned that we have so many social programs that's probably going to bankrupt us. And so when you say capitalism, basically it means market-driven economy, where individuals exchange goods under their own individual freedom. Whereas in a state-controlled environment, communism, the state tells you, this is the toilet paper you're going to use if you can get it, and this is the price. Whereas in a market-driven economy, the government doesn't get involved too much.
So it really, to clarify too, because we discussed in our last podcast on Latin America and remind me, it was El Salvador and what was the other country we were discussing? Honduras. Yeah. So we discussed them as the Marxist leaning, but socialist kind of state at this point, maybe not as far into the communist dictatorship as we're seeing in
right.
Nicaragua. So
but,
socialism, go ahead.
But they're all tilting towards China because China's giving them a lot of money, and China has no problem bribing the elite. They give them the house, they give them a car, they give them money. And so the United States organization does that, they're going to be hauled before Congress and thrown in jail. So they have certain freedoms that we don't have. And by going to China, they're trying to play the game where, if we go to China, we'll get money from China, we'll get a new stadium, and the US will send us money just to counterbalance the Chinese. So in a way, they're playing a game that makes a certain amount of sense, to be honest with you. But they're playing with fire. They're making a devil's bargain, a Faustian bargain. They Chinese get their hooks in you. It's very hard for you to get away from them. So
as we have seen in Sri Lanka and Djibouti as well. I mean, that's
yeah.
But to make the distinction, so the United States does have socialist programs, like you're saying, but we are not a socialist country. We are definitely a democratic republic. That being said, the definition of socialism, according to Merriam-Webster, basically you don't own private property, which the United States, that's not how it is. So it also suggests that it is a stage of society in Marxist theory transition between capitalism and communism, and distinguished by an unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work done, which is what we were talking about earlier, and the elites getting the money and the rest of the country not so much.
Yeah. Well, the classic example is the classroom, right? You get an A in the test, I get a D in the test, and the communism will averages out as to a C plus. So your A now becomes a C plus, and my failure becomes a C plus. So it just isn't practical. It's not fair. It's un-Christian to take something from someone else and give it to someone else without their consent.
Which is why that didn't work out. So
Yeah. So
now I think also in your paper we discussed Costa Rica.
Costa Rica, yeah, okay. Yeah, Costa Rica is a wonderful little country, and I know a number of people that have gone there, and they always come back saying what a wonderful place it is. But they're playing the game a little bit too on getting money from China, the new stadium, the new library, or whatever they get. And but at the same time, they're being pretty cautious about allowing them too much freedom. And one of the hooks that the Chinese use is the Belt and Road Initiative, where they lend you money. No one knows what the terms are until you find out 5 years down the road you can't pay the debts back. So they build a new road or the new railroad system or the new airport, but it's a loan. And the developments, the infrastructures are built by Chinese companies, Chinese laborers. The Chinese bring in the laborers. I mean, I think it was Costa Rica where they bailed out of one of the projects because they found out that no Costa Ricans are going to be employed. It was all going to be Chinese employees imported to do the thing. And then the deal was found out to be that it's not such a good deal, because once you have to pay them back and it doesn't generate the money that you envision it did, the Chinese have strictures in there that they take over the property. So again, as you mentioned earlier, the Sri Lanka, they built a port on the southern tip of Sri Lanka. It didn't generate the revenue, so the Chinese terms of their loan, they took it over. So now China has a huge port at the tip of Sri Lanka, and of course, needless to say, India is not very happy because Sri Lanka is like smack dab in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So.
And in your report, you talked about Costa Rica. Really, they're understanding the problem here, it seems like, much more than, or maybe looking at these other countries, but
yeah,
they've not seen China's promises materialize. So I believe it looks like Costa Rican, or the bureaucracy there is not very happy with China's progress in their country and the loans and the lack of transparency.
Well, the United States obviously has a big footprint in Latin America and Central America, and it has for over 2 centuries. So there's a lot of goodwill, and I don't see any Central American Hondurans or Nicaraguans or Guatemalans trying to immigrate to China. So there's a lot of goodwill there, and I think it's Guatemala, or maybe it's El Salvador. 20% of the gross national income comes from remittances from family in the United States. So the United States still has a lot of clout in the region. It's just that we're in a new world. China's a great country. They're going to do their thing, and we just have to become more aggressive. And you've heard me say this before, Joy, that I'm a firm believer in propaganda. We should be much more aggressive in Voice of America and other media outlets, and our government. I mean, the government representatives in these countries should be touting American life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the glories of America, and stop playing up our defects. Is that a word? Yeah.
As we were talking offline, we said that we are, we state that we are working toward a more perfect union. We are not perfect, but right. I think we have a great government in place, and our founding fathers put something in place that works, especially with our checks and balances that other countries don't have.
Yes. so many bad things going on in China. I mean, the genocide, the organ transplants, the repression, suppression, the surveillance state, the belligerence towards the neighbors, not only the United States, but the Philippines, Japan, in Vietnam, India. They're not a nice country. Their leadership's not a nice bunch. Why they get such a free pass is beyond me.
Well, I think people are becoming more awakened to that as well, because the awakening here in America of the Chinese spy balloon and the realization that they are doing this.
Yes.
And they also had the spy balloon over Latin America. So these countries need to start paying attention that what China is doing, and
Yes.
let's put it out there. Let's make it, hey, this is what China is doing.
Yeah.
And this is what America is doing.
Yeah.
And yes, we're not perfect, but
China's doing a great job by, between the bribes and the infrastructure loans, the Belt and Road initiatives, and then the Confucius Institutes, where they attach themselves to a university, or in some cases even a high school level, teaching Chinese culture supposedly. But of course, the culture is all positive, and you can't talk about Tibet in the so-called cultural exchange. So they do a great job at the Confucius Institute too, of propagandizing what they're doing. So I say,
again,
let's do the same.
Controlled by the government, the Communist Party of.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Larry, for this is a little bit longer brief, but thank you for your brief on your new paper that's out.
Thank you.
Appreciate
you,
you coming on. And to our listeners, you can read Larry's paper at www.ascf.us. Sign up for our newsletter, and you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and our Rumble channel. Thank you very much, and join us again for Peace Through Strength podcast.
Thank you.